So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I am the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and it's terrific to have you with us today to talk about how you can fund your endowment. As a network, we started back almost 40 years ago, 40 years next year, in talking about endowments and how important they are for our parishes and cathedrals in securing the future ministry of the church. And we still believe that. And we believe that funding them is also very important. And so we are very pleased to be joined today by our partners and friends from CCS Fundraising, who are going to share a bit about best practices around raising money to fund your endowment and other thoughts that they have in this area. I invite you to put your name and where you're dialing in from into the chat and to use the chat for any questions or comments that you might have. We have a set of additional digital workshops upcoming. We invite you to go to our website, episcopalparishes.org, to see what those are. This session is being recorded and will be shared with everyone who is registered via an email, along with the PowerPoint that our friends Luke and Chris are going to be using. So without any further ado from me, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Luke and to Chris and let them get started. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Joe, and always appreciate our friends at EPN for putting together good content. And got about 60 folks on the line, which is great. I see we are calling from far and wide, from Shaker Heights to Puerto Vallarta. So I love the fact when we kind of really are spanning the continent, here. This is great. So we have a kind of a nice session talking about endowments, endowment fundraising, and talking a little bit about sort of how that can be applicable for whatever your situation may be. So not all of us are necessarily at a place that has a 50 or $100 million endowment. A lot of us are at places that have a small one or very little endowment or none at all. And so really today we want to talk a little bit about that landscape and what are some of the things that you can do to be more effective. And Chris and I will be doing a couple things. So we'll talk a little bit about planning for it, and I'll do a little more of that. And then Chris will talk about the keys to raising money around the endowments. And we'll have some comments and discussion. And by all means, let's light up the chat feature to kind of get some comments and feedback from everybody. If we go to our next slide, I'll just do a little introduction of Chris and myself. I'm one of the partners at CCS. We're the nation's largest fundraising consulting firm, and we work across all sectors, but we were founded in 1947 working in the faith-based space, and we always have done that. So still about 25% of our work, even today, is somewhere in that space. So we work with dioceses, we work with churches, we work with seminaries, doing a variety of different types of projects. I'm based in the DC office and kind of but work throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. Chris is one of our senior VPs, and Chris has worked on a number of churches and also worked for several years on a very successful project for Seminary of the Southwest. So between the two of us, we have a lot of experiences we think we can share a little bit, but we'd love to learn from you today as well. A little bit about CCS. I kind of gave you a little commercial before. About 400 professional staff, about 600 staff altogether. We work with a few hundred clients, a year across all different spectrums. As I mentioned, we kind of done a lot of work in this particular sector, and we've been very fortunate to work with Joe since his time with EPN and come to a lot of the conferences and annual meetings. And these sessions are really great. So, and even within CCS, we have a kind of internal cabinet of folks who've worked on projects, just a little brain trust so we can be a resource for all of you. So by all means, please always think about beyond just today's call. We're here to be a resource for you. So the meter isn't always necessarily running, shall we say. Going to the next slide, we're going to do a little poll question. So this is always a technology fun and games to see if it will work. So Chris, I think, are we going to launch those or are they going to launch them in the chat? How is that going to happen again?
Yeah, so we're going to just actually go into the chat because technology was not our friend today.
I figured as much.
And the first question we'd like to hear from you all is yes or no, do you have an endowment or a reserve fund? We're monitoring the chat. Lee says yes. Catherine says yes. So lots of yeses. Yes, a reserve fund. No, but working on it. Fantastic. Yes, 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 but small. Yes. Wow. Okay. So I think we're in good company for how do we fundraise for your endowment. The next question is in proportion to your annual budget, is your do you have the endowment or a reserve fund? And would you say is it small, medium, or large?
So this
I
is
think
more of a
people,
size question.
yeah. Someone has a reserve fund, medium, large, small, micro.
Micro,
Okay,
I like that.
that was a good one.
Someone being very specific.
Okay, so we've got a lot more variety there in terms of the size and okay, fantastic. Okay, thank you. It helps us get a sense of the landscape. Luke, I'll pass it back to you.
Super. Yeah. So, we want to look at this kind of really what the impact that it can make. Obviously, there's a number of different things, and we want to kind of talk about each of those areas. So, one, the financial stability piece of it. So, by having, whether an endowment or a reserve fund or both, it gives you options, right? That it's either something that can be helpful with the operating budget, it can be helpful with special, projects and repairs that might be needed. It could help with funding a program, et cetera. The other thing is if we have a robust, and again, everything's proportionate, right, depending on our size, but it also allows us to kind of be innovative and grow in some areas. So that's important. And then lastly, that kind of sustainability kind of piece and impact so that if we can have something that allows us there as a source, it ensures sometimes that programs can always be run effectively, that maybe we need to be less reliant on doing fundraising campaigns because between money in the budget and some money from the endowment, we might be able to do small to medium sized repairs and things like that. So across the board, these things are important and they can really make an impact. It's just another added, aspect to what you're doing. Just when we kind of, ask, questions of folks, still the capital projects are still the kind of larger driver of things, where people are building something or fixing something up. And certainly with churches and church and school properties, the property gets used nearly 365 days a year, so frequently the facilities, do need to be updated fairly regularly. But what we've been seeing now more and more regularly is that, the idea of endowment and making sure that that's in line with the size of the community and what your needs are is more and more important. Particularly as the church, the numbers are staying sort of flat. They in a lot of places they might be declining a little bit. And then the other challenge in some places is you might be overly dependent on a handful of donors who are very generous. So, for example, we worked with one of our clients was in Ohio, and they had three donors who I think represented about 20 or 30% of their overall budget. So they were extremely generous, but as we all know, it's awfully hard to replace, if you have one, two, or three really large donors, and these donors all were around 90 years old too. So it's replacing those with younger donors or folks with less means. It's not an even swap, right? So that's where that endowment is important. If you go to the next slide, and a little bit in terms of kind of planning your endowment fund. So one thing we want to look at, and then Chris also make sure I don't keep going over and rolling on top of your slides. I think I go one more slide or one more section, correct?
One more section.
That's right. Okay, let's try to remind myself. But one of the things is if you do have an endowment fund, it is important to kind of have a committee that's kind of focused on that. So certainly, the rector and some vestry members would want to be part of that. You might have, if somebody is your bookkeeper or finance and does that piece of it. But externally, there might be some parish volunteers who have expertise in those areas. They themselves might be involved in money management. They might be accountants or attorneys or work in those spaces. And then, also making sure that if once you do grow the endowment and it's starting to get a little larger, that's where having some external folks who can be giving you some advice in terms of how those funds are invested, where you're keeping, what are the returns, do you diversify where the funds are? And that's where you want to lean on, the outside expertise, because we really want to think about ourselves as being sort of the stewards of those funds for the moment. So we want to make sure that we're being prudent, that we're being fiscally responsible, but we're also being thoughtful too. Some questions just to kind of, you'd want this group to be thinking about. So, one of those things where, the costs rarely go down in history, in terms of heating, lighting, all those different types of things it does to operate a church and the campus. So, is your annual giving keeping pace with your operating budget? Is your endowment maybe a larger source of funding of your annual budget? Are you overly reliant on that? And these types of things are important to think about. And then, are you anticipating if the endowment does play a large portion of that, or normally does those types of things? Is this going to be able to, when we look at our future needs, how is that going to impact the budget? The other things we also talk about is, are we going to be in a position where we have to reduce either some of the ministries, or how often or how much we do, because we don't have the funding? The middle box there on the bottom, similar to the illustration I gave before, are you becoming over reliant on a small number of older donors? So you want to make sure, really, the idea is your annual giving is reasonably robust, but also your endowment is a natural complement to that. And then what should be the endowment or the reserve funds roles? We have very clear expectations, where some folks don't always understand the difference between a reserve fund, which you can use for different things at different times, or an endowment, which, if it's a true endowment, shouldn't be invaded. And we're only using the money that's generated off the interest of that. So in terms of priorities along those same lines, like we just talked about, there's sort of three different types. You might have kind of a truly, like, a quasi endowment, where it might have some opportunities where you can go in, you might be able to go in for a certain amount. You might have, a restricted fund that can be used, but maybe only specific purposes, or it can be unrestricted and used for operations, programs, or whatever. So, as you start to grow these funds, sometimes you might have more than one, just for those same reasons, because you might want to have the flexibility to use those. In terms of the benefits, we want to be able to kind of share with people why the endowment is important. It's sort of like infrastructure. Sometimes infrastructure isn't always as interesting to people, but when you turn the light switch on, or when you turn the faucet on, you expect the lights to come on or the water to come on. That's when you understand how important infrastructure is. Same thing here too, in terms of the benefits. Why do we want an endowment? Why are those funds are important? And we want to play those back to people so they understand. It allows us to help with long-term planning. It sort of reinforces of, we're current stewards of the church, and our job is to make sure that it's there for us in the future and for the families in the future. And then overall, you can make a bigger impact in what you're doing. And the last thing that more and more folks have this has been something that has sort of captured, I think, people's interest more of late, would be that people who have a long-term relationship with a congregation, in some cases, just like I mentioned earlier, some of those folks, to lessen that impact when we do pass, is somebody might say proactively, hey, you know what? I know I'm giving pretty generously annually to the church. I'm going to leave something in my estate that either ensures that there's still a significant stream of funding coming, to church, essentially to, continue to give that level gift for years into the future, or at the very least, give the church enough runway that there might be 10 years or 20 years of a similar kind of income coming in for the future. So that's been something that more and more some folks of late have been interested in, that kind of idea. So to do all that, you need to do a couple things. You need to have some policies in place about how you're doing things, what the threshold would be in terms of if someone's going to have a restricted fund, for example. So let's say Chris is interested in ministry. if we're going to have a fund that might be specifically for a ministry, you might want to encourage, if someone's going to put that type of restriction on you, that it's at least sizable enough that it fully funds the program or funds the majority of the program, thus freeing up perhaps more dollars for other things. And also, you're going to have to track that, separately. So if you don't do that, you can find yourself with older churches, sometimes 50 or even, I know it sounds funny, but 50 or even as many as like 100 little tiny funds that are restricted. So you want to be very careful when you do those types of things about how you might name something, how you might recognize it, what its use are for. And that's by having those policies too. For some reason, if we didn't set up a policy that said, if we have any funds where we know the church no longer does those types of activities, those funds could be then used for a purpose that the donor would be interested in, or to the general operating. So you do have some kind of understanding that even if Chris is gone and we have this fund, if we don't do that anymore, it's not helpful to have a pot of money just sitting there, that money could be repurposed. And then the last thing is just the transparency. I mean, we're talking about money and funds. So we want to make sure that folks understand, how big these funds are, that sometimes things like the annual meeting is a good place to do that, but it's also good throughout the year to be able to do some basic, financial education with people to let them know, here's what the funds that we do have available. Here's maybe where the shortfalls we might have with our operating budget. Here's how we use these different funds. Sometimes even just doing some basic education of terms, what things mean. But the more open people can be into understanding about why it's there and what's it for is helpful, obviously, because some folks might be under the misperception, oh, don't we have a giant endowment? Maybe you do, but maybe you don't, but people think you do. Along those communications pieces, we want to make sure that if we're doing some things, we do seek the experts if we're talking about something specifically about things that are involved with how someone might be making a gift or investing. So we want to lean on those folks in terms of versus us thinking about how we should communicate that. And then again, just to make sure that we're transparent about how the funds are being used. Again, it's funds that are for the community and for the congregation. So we want to make sure that we have policies in place and we're following all the best practices. And that's something that's important. Again, you can use some of those different experts. So as the vestry and staff over time changes, maybe that's even something that's part of an annual retreat where we make sure that we have an understanding of those terms and rules and policies. Maybe a little dry, but it's always important. And making sure that, especially as people change over time, there's that continuity of doing it with best practices in the best way.
Okay. Shifting really to the focus here, which is how to raise endowment funds, wanted to first talk about when we think about a fundraising function within an organization, especially a church, we think about a fundraising program as a three-legged stool. So the three legs of that stool are your annual fund or stewardship pledges, any major or transformative gifts, and then of course the endowment. And to be a truly financial sustainable organization, you really need all three legs to comfortably balance your financial model. The building blocks of any initiative will be those four pillars that you see up on the slide for a successful fundraising effort. So case, leadership, prospects, and plan. A case is going to be your rationale for why you are fundraising, what you're fundraising for, and how you're going to do it. It needs to be persuasive, compelling, and communicate a sense of urgency. The second pillar, and debatably the most important, is that of leadership. Your parish needs to see that leaders are behind the fundraising effort, meaning they've been involved deeply in the planning and have personally committed financially. Thinking about prospects, your prospects really are going to be primarily your parishioners, though in some instances we have seen where you have robust community outreach programs, individuals who benefit from those programs or involved might consider providing a gift as well. And then that last pillar, the plan, really details the steps for how you are intending to meet your financial goal. It also represents the timeline for your plan and indicates benchmarks to help drive activity. Endowments at a parish are extraordinarily important, and making the case for building one are essential, so you know how to communicate with your parish about what's happening. And so the case for the endowment can include an emphasis on one or more identified needs. Something like strategic impact, such as endowment income is going to support vital mission priorities. Think about a case priority that might be focused on more long-term sustainability. And so it provides a stable funding model for future generations. Or the purpose could be something like enhanced ministry, which enables you to fund objectives outside of what your annual budget can support. It also is that comfortable little nest egg in terms of sometimes the roof needs to be replaced, or a series of windows needs to be, the rot in the windows need to be replaced. And so there's various reasons why having this sort of fund is really helpful to account for those things that we just can't always plan for. Once you've determined how you're going to use the funds, you'll want to pivot to writing an impactful case for support narrative that provides background on these plans, how you got to this point, and a call to action, inviting all of the community to be part of ensuring that that three-legged stool is stable for the financial well-being of the parish. Thinking about that pillar of financial prospects, once you have that case prepared, you'll want to start thinking about who are the right individuals to invite to make a gift. The best prospects will have the ability to give in terms of financial capacity. They'll have affinity to the parish, and you'll have to have access to that donor, meaning they're connected to you and they respond, or they're active in your parish. At a parish, the people who really fall into the center of those three considerations of affinity, ability, and access are really going to be your church leadership, parishioners, or even families of parishioners. Another consideration when thinking about parishioners who might be in a great spot to consider an endowment gift is going to be those that are ready to make a planned gift, or sometimes we refer to as a legacy gift, that will impact the parish in perpetuity. That's why an endowment effort is a much more meaningful way to engage donors who are considering something like a planned gift, because it's really about their legacy. When you think about approaching people who've been who are great candidates for that, you're really mostly going to be thinking about people who've been loyal to the church for several years, and in their prime years of 50s, 60s, 70s, or beyond. Really want to actually sit here for a little bit when we're thinking about planned giving, because there will often be policies at organizations that say something like a realized bequest gift or a planned gift will automatically be distributed to an endowment fund unless the purpose of those funds is otherwise indicated by a donor. And so it's really a great way to have sort of in your policies that any gift that comes in from an estate gift that you weren't expecting and it's not restricted in other sorts of ways, that it immediately goes into that endowment bucket. That's one policy, to Luke's earlier point, that can really start building the momentum of building your endowment. A planned gift is such an important way to grow that, because it is something that is in perpetuity. Donors can also leverage this opportunity to think about stretching their support and organizations in ways that a cash gift just couldn't possibly reach that level. When you're thinking about the factors that have been influencing gift planning cultures over the last several years, we think about the major wealth transfer that's really happening right now to the next generation. The COVID pandemic really set the stage for people to start thinking about what they're going to do in terms of their legacy and a lasting impact. And sometimes donor sophistication, though that's not always going to be a barrier to having a conversation about a planned gift. And so, one thing that Luke and I were talking about when we were planning for this is that oftentimes someone will have you, your parish, your diocese, and their estate plans, and you just won't even know about it until they've passed away and a gift comes in. And so what we like to encourage churches to do is be proactive in having those conversations. Many parishioners are going to be open to making that kind of gift, but most of the time they either just don't know it's an option, or they've made the plans and just haven't clarified that those plans have been made. And so there's always a way to begin generating that type of excitement around a planned gift, as well as with younger generations. We're really starting to see various types of conversations of multi-generational engagement. And so there are different strategies that you can implement for different generations of donors. Earlier, Luke talked about having a robust naming and recognition program as a way to motivate these types of gifts. So when you name an endowment or offer those sorts of opportunities, it's really an essential strategy. And oftentimes there's a misconception that an endowment gift doesn't have a direct impact because it's not going to current cash needs. But it really does, right? Because it's supporting the parish in perpetuity. There's a long-term impact that, when a person makes a gift, they can actually see the impact of that gift in their lifetime through a robust stewardship or recognition opportunity, and an opportunity to share their story so others are inspired to give as well. One thing we do want to flag, though, and this goes back to what Luke was saying earlier about the importance of policies, is that managing small endowment gifts can be really difficult. Not only are small funds a really challenging administrative thing to take on, particularly in a smaller community, but the returns can really be so small that recognition can be limited. For example, a 10,000 endowed fund might only generate $500 annually at a standard 5% draw rate. And so to avoid this, what we often recommend is that there's a minimum threshold for establishing a named endowed fund that, just ensures that the administrative costs are worthwhile. And so thresholds might vary, but at a minimum, we typically see 25 to 50,000 for naming an endowed fund. So coming back to that three-legged stool approach, really want to emphasize that there's a variety of ways to invite a donor to invest in your parish. One is through those annual stewardship gifts. Another is through making a major gift, a transformative gift. The amount of what might qualify for a major gift is really going to differ between different organizations. It might be something like a $1,000 gift, or it might be gifts of $10,000 or more. And then, of course, the endowment giving. And each piece of that three-legged stool really has a different function for what it's going to fund. An annual fund is going to help support annual operating costs, where a major or transformative gift is going to cover things like a new construction project or program cost. And then endowment giving is really about balancing that three-legged stool for long-term sustainability of the parish's financial model. And so the next thing we wanted to just sort of talk through is different scenarios. So Luke, would you like to go first?
Sure. Just, a lot of times there'll be opportunities where, you'll get a chance to think about how people could participate, in funding endowments or in making sort of more substantial gifts. Now, the nice thing is, when we have a connection with the church, unlike a school or a hospital or something else, I mean, that's a relationship that has probably spanned their whole life, maybe not that particular parish that they're at, but again, there's a very deep connection. So there's going to be opportunities that you can talk to people about how they could make a really lasting impact. And so some of those things is just sort of kind of keeping your ears open, for opportunities. Like we had a situation recently with one of our clients where, they were doing a campaign, and it happened that somebody was talking about the property that was adjacent to the school, and someone said, "Oh, that's Mr. Wilson's property, and he's been there for years, and he loves us, and we love him. He's great." And somebody just said, "You ever talk to him about would he ever want to? What is he going to do with the farm when he's gone?" And so that was a case where they had never really thought about that. So that when they spoke to the gentleman, He loved having the school next to his farm for years, didn't have any immediate family in the area. He did need to live there, but he didn't need the farm in terms of, to cover his retirement sort of aspects. So what he made an arrangement with the school was he would live there as long as he was able to live there on site until such time either he passed away or couldn't live on site. And then when he was gone, that the property would go over to, he essentially would allow to be able to live there, and the property would go over to the school. So in this case, just by being thoughtful about thinking longer term and vision, the school is able to sort of get a piece of property that might have cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not maybe $1 million or more. So again, sometimes, fundraising, when you're thinking about activities like this, it might be about endowments, but it might also be about, endowing a ministry or a program or activity. Sometimes you might have an event where maybe you have a speaker series that comes and someone loves that. So, when you think about those types of things, they do cost some money to put on. So again, it's always thinking about, are there things where we might be able to engage people in situations like that and have conversations with that? Maybe, Chris, before you kind of talk about a donor scenario, I saw that Albert had said, can we talk a little more about blended gifts? So do you want to tackle that, Chris?
Yeah. So when we think about blended gifts, uh, sort of another level that we can think about is where the money is coming from for a donor to consider those different types of gifts, right? So an annual fund gift might just come from your monthly budget, or a major gift is might come from assets or multi-year pledges or both. You're going to think that those are really going to be more gifts for capital projects or special projects that the parish is taking on. Gifts are generally of a more significant size. And again, I think that multi-year period that you might see in a traditional campaign environment where someone might have 3 to 5 years to pay off that pledge is really that strategy for major gifts. And then endowment, those gifts are, we've been talking about, used for more of those designated purposes examples, like we were mentioning earlier, whether it's, tackling some maintenance costs that were unexpected, or a part of it is the payout is going to support your ministry and outreach. But oftentimes what we're going to see gifts from endowment, they're going to be gifts that are coming from a mixture of assets and estate wealth, or maybe even both. And getting someone, when you think about sort of that gift pyramid and you might be moving them up, getting someone to that sort of planned gift that might support the endowment really does take time and relationship. And I think the good thing about a parish community is that you've been in relationship with many of your parishioners for many years, if not several decades. And a planned gift is likely going to be someone's largest gift in their lifetime. And I think when you're thinking about what it means to sort of be blended, is particularly in a campaign environment, something that we'll coach our clients on doing is asking for all 3 gifts in a single setting, right? We're here because we want to talk about your philanthropic investments in the parish that have been so meaningful. And first, we want to make sure that we re-secure your annual stewardship pledge. Of course, without this, we couldn't fund our annual operating needs. But now we'd like to talk to you about something even bigger that is going to be either for our capital campaign or a special project that we're doing. That gift can be more transformative because we're situated where we can consider payments over a multi-year period. And sometimes what happens in those conversations is someone says, well, I'd love to do the number you've brought to me, but I just don't think I can reach that number. And that's a perfect moment to then say something like, well, have you ever considered a planned gift? It's a way that you can stretch your vision of your intended commitment. You can see the value of the gift and the impact of the gift in your lifetime. And it will be a true testament to the relationship that you have with the parish.
I think the main takeaway with the blended gift is you're asking for, maybe more than one thing at the same sitting. And as
Yeah.
Chris said, because you might be doing that and it might be more significant, it might not be kind of a one-off thing, because it might be something, Albert, I'll pick on you because you had the good question. It might be something, if I came to you, more than likely, even if we had a nice, robust discussion, it's just like anything else. You're not going to slap your hands on the table and say, "Great, let's do it." You'd say, "All right, well, let's think about." I'd have to think about that and how I might do that. So I think the idea is it's a thoughtful approach where you're inviting people how to give. And if I use that example, like if we had a speaker series, let's say we have an annual budget of $5,000, and it covers flying in some panelists, it covers food and whatever, maybe AV, so that's what it costs to put on the speaker series every year. So a blended gift might be, if I ask Chris, hey, could you make a gift of perhaps $100,000 that maybe, you would endow this, because we'd essentially roughly get 4 or 5% that we could use, from that. But would you be willing to fund the first couple of years of the speaker series as we set that endowment up? So again, I'm asking her for sort of maybe a cash gift now, and maybe some other type of vehicle to fund the other piece. So it's a little more involved, but again, it's not super complex. And a lot of these things will just remind everybody, just like Chris and I are not, financial planners or accountants or attorneys or anything. They're going to need to talk to their own people about getting that advice and how to do things. I think our job, and on your job on behalf of the churches, is getting people to think about how they could help and what they could do, and to think bigger. And so, sometimes, depending where you are, like sometimes, if you're in the New York City area, you could have folks who are in financial services and are in the market, or work for a big Fortune 500 company. I think I saw somebody from Schenectady on the list there. There's tons of GE people who live in Schenectady. A lot of times the GE people have GE stock that they've owned for 30 years. So there might be an opportunity to talk to somebody about making a stock gift. And there's a great benefit there, because they don't pay any capital gains on the long held stock, and they're able to donate that to you. And then the nice thing is you also get all that cash at one time to go do something. So everybody sort of wins in that situation. So again, it's mainly kind of making people aware of what they could do to help us. It's sort of getting that discussion going, and more than likely they're going to be then talking to their own advisors about that. I think Jeff had a question, Chris, about how to structure endowments, about inflation. And then, so maybe you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I
A little
guess,
more technical than
yeah. Jeff, could you say, are you talking about it from just the cost of operating the endowment? Maybe I'll see your, or just expenses at the parish. I think probably expenses at the parish. So
while
I guess, yeah,
we wait on that, I just saw Margaret's question also
yeah.
about what do you do with, folks that aren't, Jeff, yeah, no, the microphones aren't on, so we just need you to type it into the chat there. But Margaret, your question, there's a lot more, folks who, are of modest means than necessarily somebody who owns, big swaths of stock. And that's what Chris talked about earlier, is, the biggest gift that most people can make, it often might be something from their estate. Chris, I'm not sure if we talked about this, but I think one of the things that you find is, I think it's 75, the stat is 75% of all estate gifts, they're found out when the attorney calls the church. So it's not that you knew Mr. Driscoll told you, oh, by the way, St. Columba's, I put you in my estate, or for either this amount or this percent. Most of the time, places don't find that about that until after the will's gone through and whoever's the executor, and then they see what the estate says, that they will contact any of the charities and say, Mr. Driscoll left you $25,000. And you're like, oh, wow, that's wonderful. but we didn't know. So what happens is you miss the opportunity to thank that person while they were still alive. And you also miss sort of the opportunity to hold them up as an example of somebody who took that extra step to invest in the endowment. And they don't need to, people don't need to know what they gave, but the fact that they did that. And that's why a lot of us will have kind of a legacy society of some type of plan giving thing where we recognize folks who do that. And that's important. It's important to sort of get folks to do that. So it's, I think, Margaret, tips, I would say with folks in that case, it's really not that different. It's getting people to be comfortable about doing that. It's something as simple as please remember the parish in your estate plans printed on all your materials, have it on your website, something very simple instructions on how they can do that, who to call to get some advice. So all those things, I know it sounds super basic, but you'd be surprised about many of you might not even have those things in place. So a lot about today is what are some of the things that you can do to create a good opportunity, a good landscape for endowment fundraising. Now, one of those is having those basics in place too. So I think that no matter what kind of the income strata of the folks in your congregation, everybody can participate in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and to that point, there are definitely significantly more complicated giving vehicles, right? Something like a charitable remainder trust or a gift annuity or gift of life insurance. And some of those actually provide income for either the organization or the donor. There's definitely more information about how to navigate those conversations with the donor, but those really, to Luke's point, are conversations that need to be had with a lawyer or an accountant. But most of the time, probably 80 to 90% of the gifts that you're going to receive that are bequests or planned gifts are really just from the remainder of someone's estate, which can be a variety of different assets that have been building over time. Jeff, to your question about declining giving, and so in terms of the how the investments are made, I think I would certainly defer to an investor, and if you're unhappy with that, maybe shop around for another one. But you know, putting in maybe doing a focused endowment campaign, or in your next campaign having a portion of those gifts go to an endowment, I think would be a really important strategy for you if you've not had any new contributions to your endowment for years. I think another thing to point to Luke's point is, you know, you could send something out, or, you know, whenever you do your stewardship campaign card, if you don't already, have a little box on there that says, I have included my estate, I have included the church in my estate plans, or I have not, and I'd like some more information. And that will give you some information that you can then follow up on to have those conversations that we're talking about, to get a sense of what does that estate gift look like? How can we celebrate it during your lifetime? And so there are some more strategies that you can do to start building that momentum. And all it takes is just for one donor willing to say, I've included my parish in my estate, and this is why I did it, and this is why it's important. And there, you'll really start to see that chain reaction.
There was another question I think Bill raised, Chris, that he asked any tips on navigating the perception of sort of a trade-off between annual giving and endowment giving, where if they're doing one, maybe they'll be less eager to do the other. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, I guess I haven't, I know that probably happens. I haven't really seen it in the parishes that I've worked with. And I think it's because there's a lot of intentionality in saying, first and foremost, what we need is for you to renew your stewardship gift. That is the lifeblood of our parish. We need to maintain what we're doing there. Even actually factor in some conversations with people asking them to increase their gift. And so you'll want to be doing that every year, right? You should always be asking for more the next year. And it doesn't have to be a significant amount more. It can be something that's just meaningful to the donor involved. And so, you know, that's one way to just make sure that annual giving doesn't fall short of your expectations, is continuously messaging that first and foremost, that's most important. I think, again, with being less eager with the endowment giving, I think it's really about creating that culture of planned giving and philanthropy at your parish. And, you know, again, having that donor that will give a testament to why they're including the parish, or talking about, you know, just talking about the opportunities, reinvigorating that conversation at your parish. You can have a planned giving Sunday, or a series of planned giving communications that start to illustrate the various opportunities and how it can be really meaningful, and how those investments fund the endowment. And just, you know, it's just really important to communicate that, and to just beat that drum sort of very at a constant pace, to just build that culture of planned giving.
Yeah, we had two other questions that were in the Q&A that Joe helpfully pulled over for us. And maybe before we tackle those, I'll just tack on to what Chris said. Sometimes even a simple strategy that we all can do is to come up with kind of a short but direct survey where we could ask people, like, one, we could sort of share it with people and say, here's sort of our current financial picture without getting really in the weeds, but like, here's where it is, and saying, you know, because of where we are, you know, you can make whatever your sort of position would be. So if you're a real big church, big campus, maybe you have a campus and a school and grounds and other things, you'd say, it's great. You know, we have this beautiful space, but we also have a really big campus, but we don't have enough of reserves or endowment to sort of, you know, take care of a place this big. So like if we were a business, you would say we're undercapitalized, you know? So the idea is like sometimes for them, it's making people aware. So we did a survey in that case to this community. It was a pretty decent sized community, but we surveyed about 400 families. About 120 came back. I think it was a four, might have been a five question. And I think I encouraged them to make it four. It was even shorter, but essentially just some simple questions that made them understand that, you know, did they understand, you know, about endowment fundraising? Had they ever thought about, you know, making kind of an endowment or a bequest gift? Would they be interested in learning more? And is the church in your estate plans already? So they had, out of the 400 people that received it, about 120 completed it. And out of the 120, 80 of them said, I'd like to come and learn more about this. And I think it was either 11, or it might have been as many as 15 people who said, oh, no, you're already in my estate. And the church didn't know that. So that's something as low tech as you can get. And so if you have email, you could do something like that. And then that enabled them to, one, have conversations with those 14 or 15 people that they didn't know about, and to thank them and said, we'd love to have you be part of our legacy society. And then two, they were able to do some educational sessions, as we talked about earlier, having some folks who are experts, local experts in those fields, come and talk about the endowment and how gifts can be made. And I think we had, of those 80 people, something like 40 to 60 of them came to one of those sessions. So again, there's some very simple things you can do where you're having conversations, you can direct people. Chris, two of the questions we had, one was about pledging to you know, either endowment giving or giving from tax deferred accounts. Maybe you want to kind of cover that a little bit, like IRAs and other things, I assume.
Yeah. So so one thing I'll say is, when you're thinking about gifts made for something like your annual stewardship campaign or a major gift campaign, motivations for that are actually less driven by a tax deduction than you might expect. It's actually one of the lowest reasons why people give those types of gifts. But to your point, actually, when you start thinking about those estate gifts, those bequests, those larger gifts, there are definitely significantly more tax implications. And what I'll say is, of all the variety of giving vehicles, I can think of 6 off the top of my head. They all have very different tax implications. And it can be a very meaningful reason why a donor is giving. I think, you know, they have, for a lot of these instances, like a charitable remainder trust. I'll give an example where it was an oil executive at a parish, and he intended to he had the parish in their estate plans, but wanted to decrease some of the capital gains tax from selling some of the stocks and put the assets in a charitable remainder unit trust. And what that meant is that the beneficiaries of that estate, their children, were able to receive payments from it during their lifetime. But at the end of that remaining life of that trust, that a certain portion of it got paid out to the parish. And so that's a more sort of complex, sophisticated model. You're not often going to be dealing with something like that, but there are a lot of different tax benefits, and they differ for each type of planned giving opportunity, whether it's the life insurance or those types of funds that have various implications for income generation. Happy to share more information about those, but I'm not sure we have time to go into each one today.
I think the quick thing is there's lots of other resources, and we can give you ours, but there's also tons of sort of stuff that's just online that you can post like on a website or have a printed material to say, here are some types of ways that you can give, because more than likely that person's going to go back to somebody who's their accountant or advisor and say, hey, what's the best thing for me to do? So for example, some folks might have, once they turn 70 or get older, they might say, I have to start taking, a draw on this, but I don't actually need those funds at the moment. I'm in a good place. So sometimes folks, instead of having that money come to them, they're able to donate that. So there's these different types of things, but most of it's, like I said, it's fairly straightforward, where either it's a cash gift towards the endowment, or it's something in somebody's estate, either as a percentage or an amount. And you can put that language, and all folks need to do is make it a codicil to their existing will. It's actually a really fairly simple thing. Maybe just we'll touch on one other thing. This want to be good about the time. I think Joe had pulled from the Q&A that somebody said some parishes are in a cash flow quandary kind of post-pandemic, and it may be because of numbers maybe have gone down or that's shifted. And it says, how can the endowment be a short-term source of operational shortfall without creating panic and a sense of hopelessness? Yeah, no, that's a heavy question there. But I would just say, I think if something has significantly changed, that all of a sudden, if there's a significant change, the endowment isn't meant to be sort of a buttress for all things, but it's, there might be something where that's where, again, the vestry would need to come together, and you'd need to think very carefully about, even short term, do you adjust this to kind of weather the storm? The pandemic is not, kind of a typical event. It's extremely, type of rare. Same wouldn't be too different than if people who are impacted, really significantly by a hurricane or something of that nature. But you have to sort of, obviously, if there's no church, there's then there's no endowment to fund the church. But the thinking, though, is to make sure that the endowment is there for the long-term viability. So you'd want to be very careful about drawing that down to cover operations and things, and you'd be much better off not changing your stance there, but more proactively talking about that issue with your members and how you could begin to address that, than necessarily invading it, because there's too many stories of somebody has gone in and taken money out of what was supposed to be a restricted fund, and it's just like taking money out of your 401k. You don't get that back again.
I actually had a parish that I worked with that had that exact situation arise. And just real quick, they did a couple things. They first went to some of their top donors and asked them to give a meaningful gift that was above and beyond their stewardship gift to help cover the shortfalls. And there was significant transparency on the financial well-being of the parish recovering from COVID and the impacts of that. Another thing that they did is they did borrow from the endowment, but when they paid it back, they paid back interest. And so that helped to make up for it. That is, I would say, a last resort, but it is another model you could do. Is if you absolutely have to borrow it back, you have to borrow it, then have a very detailed plan for when you're going to pay it back and pay interest on that.
Super. Chris, we're getting to the top of the hour, so let's maybe wrap up here. Just to remind everybody, you will get copies of the slides. Chris and I are more than happy to have, follow-on conversations. We see this as part of our gift to EPN, as anything we can do to kind of help everybody. So some things as we go forward, when you're talking about endowment gifts, these are the types of things that we talked about. If you're asking somebody to maybe do, a bigger gift, than usual, and particularly maybe something that might be a planned or an estate gift, these are the types of questions you'd want to ask is, how important is the church, for you in terms of the things that you give to? Where does it play or factor in? Is it sort of your number one thing, or is it one among many? What are the things about being part of the church that do you enjoy, or that were important to you? Sometimes we've had it where one member of the family is the church going one and the other isn't, and that one passes away, and the other one says, hey, even though church wasn't a big thing for me personally, it was important to my wife or important to my husband, so I want to do something special to Holy Cross. And so those are but you have to have those conversations and put that information out for folks to get them to think those ways. And then we can just guide them gently to different ways how they can help us. You go to the next slide, Chris. Just some takeaways. So we want to be able to show people how they can help. So something as simple as put us in your estate and please, please, please let us know that you did. Also underscore how they can help through their giving, either by making a lasting gift, possibly endowing the gift that they've already been giving. And then lastly, we want to make sure we educate people, not just at the annual meeting every year, but throughout the year with some financial education about how our endowment or our funds, our restricted funds, help fund the ministries of the church, the operations of the church. So it's, again, reminding, we're telling people how their support is doing that. And we've had plenty of questions and discussions in the chat, at least. So appreciate this from everybody, and from Chris and I. We appreciate your time today, and a lot of good questions. These are things that a lot of time get your juices flowing. So when we share the information out with you, by all means, if you want to have an additional, more weedy question for Chris or I, or if we manage not to answer one of the questions in the chat, we'd be happy to do that. And we want to thank our good friend Joe Swimmer and his team also for putting together good content like this. And we can wrap up with a minute to spare. So, and
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Chris, for also being a partner in this.
Thanks, everyone. It was such a pleasure.
All right. Take care, everybody.